Everyone's talking about gold, but no one really knows what happens behind the scenes. It seems that governments and central banks are hoarding gold.
Yes, they're holding it. Yes, they are in all likelihood, particularly China, Russia, India, are holding much more gold on an official basis than they have declared.
One of the biggest weapons that the US have, if not the biggest weapon right now, they've got shortages in all the other weapons, is the US dollar.
So the way you combat that is you own gold. Gold preserves your purchasing power over time. Challenge for China is that China has a finite number of dollars in their FX reserves, and oil, up until a few years back, was only priced in dollars.
That seems like a pretty smart way to challenge the US dollar. Do you think it would work?
I think it is working.
What do you think their end game is? It took turns I did not expect. And I learned things I did not know about either. Everyone's talking about gold, but no one really knows what happens behind the scenes and how gold. What surprised me the most is how gold does not, could move without any disclosures between governments and central banks. That's one thing that shocked me. And another thing that shocked me, I'm not sure if you talked about it or saw it somewhere else, is that countries hold gold, store gold on behalf of other countries, but somehow, sometimes that gold is not really there and there's no audits happening at all times. There was issues decades ago when the US was holding gold for another country, Venezuela's one. That was more recent. I think Germany at one stage and others. And then when those countries asked for their gold back, the US didn't have it. And they ended up returning part of it, sometimes none of it. Is that correct?
There have been stories saying that there have been discussions around how long it took Germany to get their gold back.
Mm.
What I seem to recall is Germany did get all their gold back. It took a long time, which could mean something as simple as or not innocent as typical government inefficiency, and it could be as not innocuous or not innocent as they didn't have it, they had to go out and buy it before they returned it. So I don't know. Venezuela absolutely wasn't. It wasn't the U.S. that did that. It was the Bank of England seized their
Mm.
gold under political auspices. Obviously, you've seen Russian FX reserves get seized by Europe at the behest of
Belgium.
America. So yeah, there is precedent for that kind of thing, and those types of actions, even not vis-a-vis gold, seem to be accelerating, not decelerating in today's world.
I try to kind of separate the kind of the FUD or the fear, the fear mongering that people have versus the facts. And I try to always do that whenever I'm reading anything and fact check everything. Um, but there's one thing it's hard not to be concerned about, and I want you to explain it for us. Maybe we could start there. Is it seems that governments and central banks are hoarding gold. That's number one. And number two is that the figures that are out there just don't seem accurate. And I was looking at the table of the countries that hold the most gold. I saw the US as number one, understandable. Then I saw India at number 10 and India at number 8 and China at number 6. That didn't add up for me, especially with all the news we're seeing now about China buying up gold and they're being pretty public about it. First, are governments hoarding gold and why?
Yes, they're holding it. Yes, they are in all likelihood, particularly China, Russia, India, are holding much more gold on an official basis than they have declared. There are ways. There's official gold, and then there's gold owned by the government that they have not necessarily declared. So in the case of China, they have different sovereign wealth funds. They have the official central bank FX reserves, but then there are other sovereign wealth funds that may be absolutely controlled by the PBOC or the CCP, but whose gold holdings is not necessarily tallied for official for whatever reason that may be. So yeah, I do think they are. Those numbers don't exactly make sense. It is a relatively opaque market. Why are they buying it? They are buying gold for two reasons, two primary reasons. China in particular, but others as well. The first is that it has become very apparent to I think everybody around the world, most everyone around the world, certainly at that level, that over the last 5 to 10 years, the only way the US and the West more broadly can afford to sustain their debt levels is by having negative real interest rates. In other words, having the rate of inflation, nominal growth higher than the interest rate on the bonds. And so if you are a creditor of the United States, storing the wealth of your country in bonds whose rate of inflation is below, or whose rate of interest, is below the rate of inflation, that amounts to effectively a slow expropriation of your nation's wealth by the Americans. And that's not acceptable to any number of other countries. And so the way you combat that is you own gold. Gold preserves your purchasing power over time. The other major reason they're doing this, and have been for over a decade, particularly as it relates to China and Russia, is that with the weaponization of the dollar and with the position that China and to a lesser extent Russia are in, China does have a very serious issue that's been identified over the last 10, 12 years by a number of different people, which is, if, as they continue to grow their economy, they need to buy and import more and more oil and other commodities, and I'll just say oil for short, they need to import more oil to support the growth of their economy and support the amount of debt that they have. The challenge for China is that China has a finite number of dollars in their FX reserves, and oil, up until a few years back, was only priced in dollars. And so as China was facing a situation about 10, 12 years ago where they were looking forward to say, okay, well, we need to keep growing in order to, sustain our debt and maintain political legitimacy in China. And so we're going to be importing more and more oil and other commodities, and probably means oil prices are going to be going up over time. And so as we import more oil at higher prices, all in dollars, against our finite store of dollars, we're going to run out of dollars. And when we run out of dollars, we are going to have a late 1990s Southeast Asia currency crisis. We're going to have to devalue the yuan. We're going to have high rates of inflation. We're going to have a very big drop in living standards. And that is a serious crisis that would lead to questions about political legitimacy in China. And that is simply a non-starter. And so the problem is that while they recognize that problem, they also want to not open up their capital account. They do not want to have free flow of capital in and out of China because they're afraid of a run on yuan that way. And so what they did is come upon a pretty innovative solution, elegant solution, which is they have spent the last 10, 15 years establishing offshore yuan clearing banks and finding oil exporters and other commodity exporters willing to sell the marginal barrel of oil and other commodities in Chinese yuan. Now, why would Russia sell oil in yuan? As much as Putin may not be happy with the US these days, he would still trust dollars over yuan. And the answer is China has provided for net settlement of yuan surpluses that oil exporters would earn in this case in physical gold. So if you are Russia and, oh, by the way, you're getting sanctioned by the West, so you're looking for ways around the dollar system, Russia can sell oil in yuan. They end up with yuan surpluses from selling that oil. And the system that the Chinese and the Russians have been working on for over a decade has been surplus yuan can be used to buy all the goods that are made in China, the factory of the world, and which are getting to be higher and higher quality goods. And if Russia or whoever else still has yuan left over by virtue of this trade, they can recycle that into gold that floats in Chinese yuan terms. And that's a really important part of the deal, because no one may trust the Chinese government, but everybody trusts gold more than the dollar. And the gold floats in yuan terms.
That seems like a pretty big deal. Like it feels like China's just going back to what the US was in the 70s. Like the only way,
with a couple wrinkles. There's two important wrinkles. So China learned from the mistakes of the US in the 70s. So when we went on, post World War II, Bretton Woods gold standard, there were two mistakes. Number one, the US pegged the price of gold to the dollar. That was problem number one, which is very restrictive for the US's ability to run deficits. As we later saw, we had to go off the gold standard because of deficits around the Vietnam War and LBJ's Great Society. The other problem was we used our own gold to satisfy those claims. So we basically had to supply the gold. And so the whole, not only did we fix the price of gold to dollar, which is a mistake, but everybody knew what we had in gold. And so you could see the size of our deficits relative to our pile of gold. It was very obvious to the whole world by the mid 60s. There was no way we could cover what we had written in terms of IOUs out of our gold without devaluing the dollar versus gold. And immediately that touches off a run on gold. So what the Chinese did to fix these two mistakes is number one, China, the price of gold is allowed to float in yuan. There is no fixed rate that China is exchanging this at. And that is important because Secretary Connolly, Treasury Secretary Connolly in 1970 famously said the dollar is our currency, but it's your problem. In other words, we're going to run these deficits, we're going to inflate, and there's nothing you can do about it. You're just going to have to eat it with your debt holdings. The Chinese, the way they're treating gold, allowing yuan gold to float in yuan terms, is, hey, sell us oil in yuan. If you end up with net yuan surpluses, you can buy gold with it at these offshore clearing banks around the world, which, oh, by the way, are located in gold trading or refining hubs like London, Singapore, Dubai, Switzerland. And then the gold will go up or down based on how we manage our finances. And so if we, the Chinese government, keep inflating, then the price of gold in yuan is going to go up. Your purchasing power of the gold reserves you have from doing trade with China is going to buy you more stuff from China. So it's the yuan is our currency and it's our problem. Basically, sets up a virtuous cycle of trade, whereas the American, our currency, but your problem, requires the Americans to take purchasing power from treasury holders. The Chinese system, as they have set up, allows gold to rise to preserve and or grow purchasing power in yuan terms for their creditors, which then has them buy more yuan goods, which then has China buy more oil, which means you get this virtuous cycle trade. So that's change number one. The other thing the Chinese did that's pretty elegant is the Chinese aren't allowing gold in mainland China to circulate to settle this trade. In other words, once physical gold goes into mainland China, it can't leave. There are still capital controls on gold. But Hong Kong, it can come and go. The Shanghai Gold Exchange International Board in Shanghai, there's a free trade zone where gold can come and go. And so essentially, China is using the gold in London, the gold in New York, and the gold. They're essentially creating a short squeeze in gold. Gold price is higher because their gold is not allowed to move. So they can't run out of gold. And oh, by the way, because they've been encouraging their citizens to buy gold since 2002, the government has, as this Chinese trade drives the price of gold higher, it also recollateralizes balance sheets in China. So the people that may have bought an apartment and are now underwater because apartment prices have fallen, they also own gold in all likelihood. And as the price of gold rises as a result of this, their balance sheet improves. Chinese commercial banks own a lot of gold. Their balance sheet rises, increases the amount of collateral they have. The Chinese government owns way more than they've said. So those are the two ways. Is number one, they're not pegging it to the yuan. And number two, they're not using their gold to settle these things. They're using everybody else's gold.
Wow. Okay. That seems like a pretty interesting model because, one of the biggest weapons that the US have, if not the biggest weapon right now, they've got shortages in all the other weapons, is the US dollar and their control of the financial system. Now, the numbers are pretty staggering. People like to talk about the de-dollarization, but the USD's shares of global foreign exchange reserves, I know it dropped from 70, I think it was 71% in 1999. It went up, it went all the way down to 58 to 60% by mid this year. So a few months ago. So those look alarming, but something similar happened in the 70s and the US dollar continued to dominate. I think it's about 90% of global payments are still in dollars, if my numbers are correct. So you still see the dollar being very, very dominant. So then you think, all right, cool, how could we be, when you got, and plus you look at the euro dollar market, people should research that. It's just a fascinating, dark hole that no one knows how it functions, but all the money goes through there. I still struggle to understand how the euro dollar market works, how big it is. But suffice it to say, the dollar still controls the financial system. But so China has to break that. That's the only way to kind of break the US hegemony that currently exists. And the way they're doing it, to kind of simplify it, is they're essentially trying to settle more transactions with other countries, India, Brazil, Russia, etc. With the yuan, with the Chinese yuan. And then those countries maybe don't want to hold too much yuan because it's still not as trustworthy as the US. Hasn't proven itself over many years. There's a lot of question marks on the Chinese economy, and it's not as open as the US economy in terms of all the data, having a lot of visibility there. It's not as transparent. So they go to these countries. They're like, hey, hold the yuan. You could use it to buy things from us. We are the manufacturer of the world. We produce everything. I think that's enough of a selling point, in my opinion. But hey, if you don't buy enough stuff because your economy is struggling, you can actually redeem that money in gold. And I also read somewhere that they're building something called the China's Gold Corridor. They're building all these different reserves or storage facilities around the world in those countries. So if there's a country that's doing business in China, they have a big storage facility there that China hold gold in. They hold their reserves in, or the country can also hold reserves in those facilities and get loans from China. It's a different discussion, and then they can redeem the yuan for this gold. That seems like a pretty smart way to challenge the US dollar. Do you think it would work?
Oh, I think it'll work. I think it is working. I mean, it's
Oh,
when you quote those FX reserve numbers, right? Those importantly are only other FX currencies, right? Those are only other fiat currencies. Once you include gold into the mix as an FX reserve, the picture changes entirely, because what you would see is that the dollar's share of FX reserves plus gold is down to 46%. It's already a minority, and gold is up to 30%. So after another couple years of 1,000-ton central bank gold purchases, and let's say another 30, 40, 50% rise in the price of gold, gold will be bigger than dollars in global FX reserve terms. And that's going to be a really interesting moment of cognitive dissonance for people talking about the dominance of the dollar and the dollar system's never going to change, when gold is a bigger part of global FX reserves than the dollar is. If gold is the biggest FX reserve asset, not dollars, is the dollar still the primary reserve currency? I don't know, but I can tell you that's what we're going to be within 2 years. Now, I think the way they are setting up, I've seen a couple reports of it. Hong Kong's really the only one I've seen so far. There have been rumors of Saudi and others with these local country vaults. It would be a brilliant way to do it, because ultimately, again, here the deal is the Americans will let you buy gold too, but you got to leave it in New York, and the English will let you buy gold, or you got to leave your gold, your American gold, gold from trade with the Americans in London. And oh, by the way, like we let off the show, the Brits have already grabbed Venezuela's gold, right? That gold is not safe. Or the Chinese system is, hey, don't trust us. We'll put a vault, an SGE vault, Shanghai Gold Exchange vault, in your country, and we'll store that gold in your country. That's a pretty good offer. And I think ultimately, like I said, it's not about them attacking the dollar per se, but rather, like you said, the dollar has been weaponized repeatedly. So it isn't a defense against that. And it's a defense against China's own vulnerabilities that we discussed before. And it's using what is ultimately, and what has always been, the dollar's Achilles heel. The dollar's Achilles heel has always been the unallocated gold market centered in London, which is, right, if the price of gold goes to the moon, what does every person say? Or most investors say, well, if gold goes to the moon, that discredits the dollar, that threatens the dollar, that threatens dollar dominance, for the reasons we just discussed. It'll be a much bigger part of global FX reserves. Well, part of the way that price of gold, that dollar dominance in London, has historically been managed for the last 50 years, or certainly a lot of the last 50 years, has been through the expansion of unallocated gold derivatives, credit gold, centered in London. And so that's a fancy way of saying, if demand for gold rises, there's two ways that can be addressed, right? Gold is relatively fixed supply. If demand for gold goes up a ton for whatever reason, like in the 70s, if it kind of continued into the 80s, you can let the price of gold rise and let the free market, right? Price will settle, will balance, will demand and supply. But when price of gold rises, that has major macro implications for the dollar and everything else. Or you can leave price where it is, and then you can allow the unadulterated expansion of unallocated paper gold claims. In other words, you can sell 100 paper claims on every ounce of gold, and thereby, with credit gold, satisfy demand on some level and keep prices contained. I don't know the degree to which that has happened in recent years, but historically it happened in some fairly significant way, and we've seen glimpses of that through history, not least of which back in the late 1990s, where there were some real issues around that. But the point here is that as China facilitates this drain of London gold, it puts, through expanding trade as a net settlement asset for yuan denominated commodity trade, over time, at some point, it starts to put upward pressure on physical demand in London. And then that forces US, UK policymakers into a choice. How much gold do we let go before we start letting the price of gold rise and just let markets work? And I think we're sort of beyond that point based on what gold has begun doing in recent years.
Is it true that the US was pulling out their gold from London just before the tariff war when Trump came into office again?
I don't know. I do
If I'm
know
wrong,
that.
correct me. I thought I read it
No,
somewhere.
no, I don't. What I can tell you, I don't know if they were pulling it out of gold or not. You saw a gentle decline in gold LBMA volumes around the city. If I'm going from memory, earlier this year, last year. Uh, but what I do know is that you could see in U.S. trade statistics starting around December of last year and into the first quarter of this year, somebody was importing so much gold into this country that it had knocked down GDP into a technical recession. In other words, we were importing and it was gold. There were so many gold imports that the United States, I don't know, whoever tracks that, Bureau of Economic Analysis or Department of Commerce, whoever it was, they were literally stripping gold imports out of the economic data because it made it look like GDP was falling 4% in the first quarter. And when you do the math, again, I'm going from memory here, but I want to say it was like $500 billion in annual, $500 billion at an annualized rate of gold imports. So it was a lot. So somebody was bringing gold, a lot of gold, into the United States from
We don't know
somewhere.
who it is.
We don't know who it is, but having had conversations with various market players over time in that business, and even looking at what we can see publicly throughout history, right? When the Hunt brothers in 1980 tried to create a run on physical silver and the system did not want that to occur, they turned COMEX silver into a sell only futures market. And they basically said, you're not allowed to do that, right? When you look at COMEX inventories, at any given day, you can look at COMEX inventories, multiply it times the price of gold, and it's, in the grand scheme of things, it's not that much gold. And so in theory, at any moment in time over the last 10, 20, 30 years, any medium-sized hedge fund who are very profit motivated could have showed up at COMEX and said, I'm going to buy all these gold futures. I'm going to demand physical gold delivery. I'm going to break it. And we're going to create this super spike in gold and I'm going to get rich. And yet none of them ever did. And my point here is that gold is a political metal. You don't just get to be a private market player, show up and squeeze gold for all the reasons we just discussed. It's a lot more than just some, pet rock commodity trading thing. It is still a systemically important asset. And so my point here is that whoever was bringing all that gold in had to have been systemically important. So I don't know, and had to effectively have had the blessing of the U.S. government to do that. So whether that was Treasury, whether that was a systemically important financial institution, or in the parlance, too big to fail bank, I don't know. But a gun to my head, I would if I had to guess, it was either the U.S. government or somebody with the U.S. government's blessing or acting as agent for the U.S. government, and specifically the U.S. Treasury.
Going back to your initial point of China's strategy to try to break the US dollar, if they succeed, what does that mean for the United States? Everyone loves to talk about de-dollarization, but I don't think people understand the repercussions if the world does de-dollarize. What does that mean for the US? What does that mean for the global economy? What does that mean for US hegemony?
I think it means the biggest economic boom / renaissance since the immediate aftermath of World War II. I think global nominal economic growth it just explodes higher. I think you see we know who the winners and losers were of this iteration of the last 40 years of US dollar hegemony, right? Which is Wall Street, the last 40 years of US dollar hegemony. And I would back up 1 second and say there have been various stages of US dollar hegemony, right? So from 1940 to 1980, what was good for General Motors was good for the United States. That was US dollar hegemony. From 1980 to 2020, what was good for Goldman Sachs and what was good for the US Treasury market was good for America. That was sort of, part two or the second iteration of US dollar hegemony. I think what we're seeing, what China is doing with gold, it will ultimately result in the US dollar hegemony 3.0, which is what's good for the US defense industrial base and the US middle and working class will be good for America. And that'll run from 2020 to 2060 in keeping with the 40-year periods. Why do I say that? Well, let's see who won in US dollar hegemony 2.0. We send our factories and jobs overseas. They send us stuff. We send them dollars. They send the dollars back into our financial markets and specifically treasury markets. And that's how it worked. So who won? China won. Wall Street won. Washington won. Who lost? U.S. defense industrial base lost. We can't make anything here. U.S. working
Just rely
class
on
lost.
China for everything.
Exactly. It's certainly critical components, right? As we saw with rare earths. The U.S. working class lost and the U.S. middle class lost. So if we're going to listen to what we're seeing every day, America is fundamentally reversing the flows of U.S. dollar hegemony 2.0 under U.S. dollar hegemony 3.0. We're bringing these factories back. We want people to invest here. We're done exporting jobs. We are done being dependent on China to build critical components for the U.S. military. So if we're reversing the flows of U.S. dollar hegemony 2.0, it stands to reason we're going to reverse the beneficiaries, at least on a relative basis. And so if Wall Street, China, and Washington won in U.S. dollar hegemony 2.0, in U.S. dollar hegemony 3.0, who's going to win? The defense industrial base, inflation, gold, the U.S. middle and working class, and America overall. You're going to see if wealth inequality blew out during U.S. dollar hegemony 2.0, it's going to narrow in U.S. dollar hegemony 3.0. Now, so when you overlay that with what you were saying before about the Eurodollar market, right? The Eurodollar market, at the end of the day, if we wanted to simplify it in a 5-second elevator pitch, is the whole world is massively short dollars. The world's massively short dollars, and the dollar goes down. Everyone in the world gets a debt jubilee. So you're going to get debt jubilee globally as the dollar falls. You're going to get a reshoring here, expansion of middle working class, reinvestment, inflation, and the inflation and the yield curve control on the inflation is why the dollar is going to fall in part. It's win-win-win. It's win-win-win, except for treasury holders. Well,
But how so you said dollar hegemony 3.0 and how that's going to compare to 2.0. But what I'm trying to understand is how is that linked to that's not really de-dollarization. Essentially, how is it still a dollar hegemony and US hegemony if governments are moving away from US dollar? Isn't de-dollarization, doesn't that mean moving away from settling with the US dollar and maybe settling with gold or another currency or the yuan?
Mm-hmm. It's exactly what it is. And as we've learned in this country, last 5, 8 years, 10 years, 25 years, it's not about what something is. It's about what you call it, right? Operation Iraqi Freedom, the Affordable Care Act, the Patriot Act.
Iraqi freedom.
This isn't de-dollarization. This is dollar hegemony 3.0, right? So
okay. You're a good marketer. So, but the reason that will reasonably be good for the US is a drop in the value of the dollar essentially brings manufacturing back to the US.
And brings manufacturing back to the US. It allows the world to deleverage, right? If everyone owes dollars and the dollar drops, imagine if you had a mortgage in Argentine pesos and the Argentine peso collapses. Are you going to have more money to spend or less money to spend? You're going to have a lot more money to spend. You're going to go buy a car. You're going to go on vacation. You're going to buy something for your kids, right? Same kind of thing. If you are the world and you're short dollars by virtue of this Eurodollar system and the dollar falls sharply by virtue of these flow reversals, while the Americans are building new factories, you're going to be like, oh my gosh, I have all this balance sheet capacity. What am I going to do? I'm going to go help the Americans build a factory, and then I'll have a equity stake in a factory in America like the Japanese did over the last 40 years. Great. Let's do that. And oh, by the way, I'm going to consume a lot more, because if I'm China, America keeps saying we need China to consume more, need China to consume more. China can't consume more until they have the ability to buy their commodities in their own currency. So we're giving them that ability. That is also with the gold settlement going to send gold much, much higher to serve as sort of the neutral reserve asset of this whole system. That's going to improve Chinese balance sheets further, Indian balance sheets further. So now all of a sudden, imagine how wealthy 2.8 billion Chinese and Indians are if gold's at $10,000 an ounce, $15,000 an ounce. You think they're going to buy anything out of their factories and the new American factories? Probably. That's why I say if we actually are successful in this move, this de-dollarization spun as US dollar hegemony 3.0, it could be the biggest economic boom in literally since World War II for the whole world.
I remember a comment Trump made a few months ago. I think he was talking about Bitcoin, and he talks that will remove the stress off the US dollar. I think someone asked him, isn't that a threat to the US dollar? He said that could be a good thing for the US dollar. Goes to your point. And it brings, he's trying to bring manufacturing back to the US. You've talked a lot about obviously the US economy, slightly about the Chinese economy. I want to ask you about a couple of economies. Let me start with this before China. I want to talk about Russia because obviously the Ukraine war, and we know about the sanctions that were placed on the two oil giants in Russia, and that seemed to hit Russia pretty hard. I think Chinese state majors already cut imports, at least seaborne imports from those two suppliers, from Rosneft and Lukoil. And that's going to have a $10 billion a month loss, according to some estimates. Putin said it will have some losses, but no bow to the US. Even Putin admitted it will have some losses for Russia and for their war economy. Have you looked into the Russian economy? Because whenever I talk to analysts, if they're pro-Ukraine, they say the Russian economy is crumbling. If they're pro-Russian, they say the Russian economy is humming along, killing it, and Europe is dying, and the US is struggling. Looking at just the numbers from what we have right now, how would you describe the Russian economy?
What they report, right? And it's running like a war economy, right? It is very strong, very inflationary. Some maybe goods rationing popping up here and there, right? There have been reports of some gasoline rationing here and there as a result of some of the drone attacks on different refineries around Russia. It seems to have been more on a spot basis than something wholesale. So there too, like you said, the pro-Ukraine say, oh, it's there's shortages all over, and the Russians say, hey, there's no shortage anywhere, and the truth is usually the case is probably somewhere in the middle. So they're running it as a war economy. It's interesting, this dynamic that I highlighted with gold. You can see it already empirically working in Russia, right? Russia had FX reserves seized at the beginning of the war. They have fought this very expensive war, and yet Russian FX reserves and foreign debt levels, Russian FX reserves are at the highest level in ever, going back at least 40, 50. The price of gold just keeps going up, right? They're basically, they keep settling in gold, and gold reserves keep rising, right? So the value of the ruble keeps falling against gold, but essentially what they've been doing is revaluing their gold reserves higher using their oil production. It's just the flip side of the coin to the China dynamic we discussed earlier. So I think the Russian economy it's running as a war economy. It is hot. It is inflationary. They're doing what they can to manage the inflation. And, ultimately, as long as China is willing to stand by them and continue to supply them, it is I think they've got the stronger hand.
What happens to a war economy when the war ends? How easy is it to pivot away from a war economy and revitalize the consumer economy?
I think it depends on the circumstances, right?
And the reason I ask is just to understand that people are making the argument that Putin wants the war to continue, does not want peace because he's become dependent on the war economy. And he's worried that once you move off the war economy, that could lead to fractures within the Russian economy, could threaten his grip on power.
I don't know. I think it depends on circumstances, but I would go back to post World War II in the U.S. Obviously, a bigger, wider war. There was more destruction around the world, but the consensus view among a lot of economists, the view of a lot of economists, coming back when you read the history books was that, well, as soon as World War II was over, all these GIs are going to come back. They got nothing to do. We're going to go right back into a depression. Obviously, they could not have been more wrong, those economists. We had this enormous boom for a number of different reasons. And so, I think the Russian economy would be fine. I would probably fade those comments. I don't think that would be the
I
case
agree.
that he
I
would
think
do that.
especially the US economy, the Russian economy, all the sanctions will probably come off, that the war's ended, and it'll open up again. We'll have access to the SWIFT system. We'll do business with the US. Probably a deal with the US will include a lot of benefits, a lot of other deals across the world between the two countries. Tourism. I think, if anything, an end of the war could lead to probably the biggest boom Russia's gone through for a long time. It's all speculation, but I just don't think there's any credence to the argument that Putin wants the war to continue because the economy is doing so well as a war economy. What about the
I think
Chinese
that's right.
economy? What about the Chinese economy? That one's another mixed bag. I struggle. I've talked to experts that say the Chinese economy is, booming, is going to beat the US in every metric over the next few years. And I'll talk to others that say there's a lot of, they're struggling with overcapacity, struggling with deflation. They got empty malls, prices dropping, real estate marketing struggling. Real estate market. Where do you stand on this?
I think the economy there is fine. I don't think it's booming. I don't think it's about to collapse either. They're managing a tricky situation, right? They do have a demographic issue as classically defined, right, in terms of the number of old versus the number of young as a result of the one-child policy over so many years. They, I think, are using AI much more effectively to date than the West is. In other words, they have integrated it into manufacturing processes, into daily consumer lives, phones, etc. So the standard of living is improving. The amount of output is actually so high, like you said, that you frequently hear from the West and others of like, hey, they're producing too much. They're flooding our markets. It's partly because they're so efficient, and partly that efficiency, that productivity is AI supported. You see, what I hear from people over there when I get updates on what it costs to go to the hospital, what it costs to get a full meal, etc., what it gets to buy a train ticket. I'm jealous, to be honest. The standard of living in a lot of ways from all of these friends I have over there that are there is higher there than it is here, right? There was there's fascinating what was it, Red Door or Red Car, whatever that the app was for a moment in time when TikTok had some trouble earlier this year. There was a lot of conversations going back and forth between average American citizens and a lot of Chinese citizens for a bit, and there were a lot of Americans going, wait a second, why is it so cheap to buy a meal, go to the doctor, etc. there relative to here? And they kind of quickly, that those conversations sort of stopped for any number of reasons, I suppose. But I think ultimately you're seeing whatever you're seeing there, 4% growth, 5% growth. It's slower.
Do you trust these
purchasing
numbers?
power, what's that?
Do you trust
Do I
these
trust
numbers?
Them? As much as you can trust any sort of economic number of a on a purchasing power parity basis, their economy is a third bigger than ours. So is it 4? Is it 5? Is it 2? Is it? Here's the numbers that maybe the most oversimplified way to gauge is Chinese citizens are still buying gold in enormous numbers, and this is spun into they're buckling down for a crisis. But that's, if you look back historically, if you follow the flows of gold, that's the country that's winning, right? If you look from 1905 to 1940, gold was flowing into America, flowing into it. This is pre-World War I, during World War I, after World War I, leaving Europe, coming to America. Gold is, and then from 1965, gold was flowing out of America. Definitely flowed out of America in the 90s and 2000s.
Where to go to
China.
Where China was later. No, 90s, 2000s was China. What 60s, 70s, 80s?
No, that's right. And
Who did go
I
to
even look
that
here,
period
right? If I
prior to
look around
China?
America, if I look around America, right, when you go through a rough neighborhood, where do you see? We buy gold stands, right? So the neighborhoods that are in trouble in America, there's always somebody taking gold off of the people there, right? They're selling gold. So I guess if
Yeah.
I look, do I trust 4%? I don't know. Here's what I know. The Chinese people are feeling, have enough surplus of savings at the end of every month to buy gold. They can't be doing
What do you
that
think?
bad.
What do you think of that dependence the US and China have to each other? Uh, China needs the US consumer, haven't been able to replace it even after all those years. Obviously, as we've seen, the US is just addicted to cheap Chinese goods, and they need Chinese minerals, rare earth being one example. Um, do you think that dependence will continue? Are we seeing the two countries decouple? Because if they do decouple, wouldn't that lead to more geopolitical risks, especially when it comes to Taiwan? Because now there's less economic risks if the two countries fight. So I kind of don't want them to decouple. I want them to continue being dependent on each other, kind of peace through globalization. What are your thoughts?
What we classified it as last week or 2 weeks ago in a report for clients was EMAD, EMAD, right? Economic mutually assured destruction. That's how I would
Yeah.
classify the relationship. Um, and so it needs to be, if I understand why the US wants to decouple in certain areas. And I think a lot of it is around, oh my gosh, they're catching up to us or surpassing us in a lot of things we never thought they would. Um, and so I understand the impulse, but if it's done too fast, given debt levels around the world, in China, in the West, you're going to have the mother of all debt crises, right? I mean, think about this.
Mm.
Lehman Brothers had an $800 billion balance sheet, and it going bankrupt was enough to nearly tip over and collapse the whole global banking system. China's a $37 trillion economy. They in purchasing power parity basis, $40 trillion economy. They like between that and the debt levels in the system, they're a sudden swift divorce economically you would ripple through global supply chains. The inflation would break global bond markets almost instantly. It's just simply it's economic mutually assured destruction.
Yeah, I was thinking on a lighter scale. So the Chinese consumer begins to replace the US consumer. US production starts to pick up, manufacturing picks up and replaces some of the Chinese manufacturing. And rare earth minerals, the US brings some of it home, but more importantly, finds other supplies like the deal they just did with Australia, they did with Japan. So that kind of light decoupling, I think complete decoupling is not feasible for the two biggest economies. Um, do you see that happening, or even that's overblown?
No, I think that's going to happen. I think it's going to take a lot longer than consensus thinks. And I think it's going to be a lot more inflationary than consensus thinks. In other words, you're hearing people in America frequently say, well, we can do this in 1 to 2 years if we work really hard, maybe 3 years, right? We did this in 1940 on a Manhattan Project scale. Um, that I think is complete hopium. When you look at what the U.S. did in 1940 to reshore, uh, the Fed balance sheet, the U.S. implemented yield curve control. The Fed balance sheet rose 10x in 3 years. Um, they rationed goods. They put in capital controls. They raised the top marginal tax rate in the United States to 90%, 90%, to help control inflation. Oh yeah. So like there's these people saying, well, we can just do like we did in 1940. And I say, okay, great. Now tell me what else we did in 1940 to facilitate that. And they never know those other things. And so I think we are going to do a light version of that decoupling. I also think it's going to take 5 to 10 years. And I also think it is going to require some version of yield curve control or yield curve control light, either outright or de facto, which means much weaker dollar, much higher secular inflation. And that's just, again, if we look at this US China economic relationship, one of the fundamentals of it was that it was disinflationary. It lowered inflation. It supported the bond market, as we were talking about earlier. To me, it strains credulity to think that we could reverse the economic relationship that was very disinflationary and supported the real value of the bond market for the last 20 years, 25 years, and think it's also going to be disinflationary and support the bond market. Like, no, it'll be great for growth. It'll be great for the U.S. Be great for China, um, but it's not going to be great for long-term bonds. The real value of long-term bonds. I mean, you're going to be paid every dime you rode, but I think some form of yield curve control,
Mhm.
repression, debt debasement has to take place under even a light the lighter version of the separation.
Another point on that separation and that kind of back and forth between Xi Jinping and Trump. Who would you say has who by the balls economically? Is it China with the rare earth? They control about 90% of refining, 80% of supplies, and obviously the cheap goods. And I'm in ecom, so I was talking to my team, to one of my companies. I'm like, guys, can we start manufacturing in the US for one of my companies? I was just today. They're like, Mario, it's just not feasible. It's just too expensive. Look, just do another deep dive. And it's for a pretty simple product for one of my companies, and they're going to give it a shot. But they immediately said it's just impossible. So does and obviously rare earth are needed for US weapons, electronics, everything, and then the US has China by the balls through what? Through demand for their goods, the US dollar, control of all these different choke points, the Malacca Straits, the Suez Canal, where China gets their oil, Malacca Strait, not Suez Canal, the Red Sea, I think it is, where China gets their oil. What's that one called? The one that Iran, the Strait of Hormuz, the Strait of Hormuz, that US, the US could block, or Malacca Straits, that US has all those bases around there. So that's what I feel like the US has as a leverage card. Obviously, I hope we don't get there. Just kind of disrupt Chinese economy if it gets to that level. If there is that back and forth, I'm not talking about a war, but I'm talking about an economic war. Who would suffer more?
I think it's important. I think they would suffer equally, but I think they wouldn't suffer equally at the same time. And I think that's the critical point. And so what I wrote earlier when we first went to Liberation Day, when we first did Liberation Day, April 2nd, what I said is this is economic mutually assured destruction. This is not, but this is like an MMA fight, except one fighter has badly broken ribs and the other fighter knows it. And the fighter with badly broken ribs is the US, and China knows it. And so if one MMA fighter knows the other one has badly broken ribs, I'm sure you've seen fights. What do as soon as one guy knows the other guy's hurt? Beat on it.
Poke him in the eye and try to avoid losing the match, as we saw a couple of days ago. But yeah, so US has the broken ribs. Can you explain those broken ribs? What are those ribs? Is it just a dependence on Chinese goods or rare earths?
It's the bond market. It's the bond market.
Okay.
At the end, and we saw this in April, right, where we Bessent got on with Tucker and said, hey, as the debtor, we have all the leverage. And he was sure of it. I'm a student of economic history. We have all the leverage. China has no leverage. That was, I think, April 7th. Literally on April 9th, Trump did his first, taco. Trump always tickens out. Why? Because the U.S. Treasury market was getting so dysfunctional. Volatility in the Treasury market was more extreme than it was in 1987 stock market crash, 9/11, Lehman Brothers bankruptcy, great financial crisis. Oh yeah, it was way worse. It was way worse. The Treasury volatility, the move volatility index went up to like 175 for like a morning, and that was it. And that's why so basically, what does that mean for the layman's terms is that the U.S. and China would both ultimately collapse without each other. I think if they tried to do a hard break like that. The problem is we know empirically, I don't have to speculate. We saw this already 6 months ago. The U.S. bond market began collapsing within 7 trading days. 7 trading days, a week and a half of Liberation Day. The Chinese, yeah, they were absolutely hurting, but they probably would have gone another 7 months, 8 months, 9 months before they would have. And so basically, if the U.S. wanted to take that pain, basically, oof, the bond market is collapsing. Fine. Rates are going up in a recession. Fine. We just had a failed treasury auction. Fine. Oh my God, interest rates for the U.S. government are 10 and we literally can't make the interest payment. Fine. Obviously, that none of those fines are ever going to happen. The second the treasury market started to dysfunction, taco. Let's de-escalate. And so I think it's less who has more leverage or less leverage and more who cries uncle first. And empirically, the United States has cried uncle first multiple times. First with the debt, and then more recently with the bond market, and more recently with rare earths. With one of the more important things this year that I think is still not well internalized by financial markets and certainly not the general public is the United States ran through between 10 and 15% of their high-end air defense missiles in June in medium intensity combat, helping defend Israel from Iran after that war flared up. The second Chinese says we're not sending them any more military rare earths, that's another point of like, at the highest levels, it's understood that means the Americans can go to conventional war at medium intensity for 2 months at most.
How did we get here? That's pretty scary. You're talking about the world's biggest economy, the world's biggest military, essentially dependent on their biggest rival, which is a good thing because then it avoids, and I think they're, again, both dependent on each other. As you said earlier, I think we'll see a lot of cracks in the Chinese economy. The Chinese economy will take a massive hit as the US consumer stops buying from China. But, okay, it is a good thing in that sense, but how did it get to a level where China controls all, like, rare earths? Like, wasn't it obvious that you're just giving your biggest rival, the fastest growing economy, control of probably the most important minerals in today's age? I don't understand how policymakers didn't think that through. And I'm sure you've talked to them. I'm sure you've talked to other experts. Wasn't the alarm right? I remember when I was in high school, rare earths was being talked about back then, but it feels like it's just being ignored. Why? I know it's dirty to process, but you just don't give that control to your biggest rival.
You know, in 2010, China weaponized rare earths against Japan. There was some sort of trade spat or what have you, and the Chinese
border spat,
right?
Yeah, exactly. There was just a border spat. I think there was one Japanese boat, Chinese boat that crossed into the South China Sea. It's very, very minor clash, and China weaponized it. Japan folded very quickly within days. I think it was weeks or days.
Oh yeah,
that should have been. Isn't that enough of an alarm for the US to take action?
Well, let's contrast that, right? So in 2012, the United States weaponized the dollar, the SWIFT system. You know, the Europeans did it at our behest, technically, and hyperinflated Iran using the SWIFT system, right? Remember, we kicked Iran out of the SWIFT system. Similar sort of nuclear option. What did the Chinese do? They immediately stopped buying treasuries in 2013. They start buying gold. They begin setting up parallel structures. They begin negotiating to buy oil and commodities in their own currency. They instead of buying treasuries, they start buying hard assets and hard asset stores and ports around the world, right? So their policymakers looked at that vulnerability and immediately took action. What did ours do? Nothing.
Yeah, why? Yeah.
There's only three possible answers, in my opinion, and I've written this. Naivete, right? Like, that generation of policymakers came of age. They were essentially born on third base and they thought they hit a triple and everyone's always going to hold hands and be nice and everything. So naivete, dogma, right? So dogma of free trade, where, the Chinese refuse to be free trade, but we're free trade. And so we have to set a good example. Or treason. They were corrupted. They were on the take.
Which one do you think it is?
I think it's some combination of the three. I don't think the corruption thing is widespread, but look, you can see very clearly politicians have, China has acquired significant influence in Washington. That's hardly controversial to say, in my opinion. They have significant influence across corporate America.
I haven't looked into it. Can you explain that to me? How much influence? I've looked into APAC, obviously, after the whole saga with America first and Israel first. I've dug into that. I understand Israeli influence in the US, and I was surprised by how APAC functions and how US politicians go to Israel, etc. So I understand that. I understand how Israel did a great job leveraging that influence. But how did China do it?
I think it's, you read any of these sort of China books, whether it's 100-Year Marathon or what have you, it's sort of the good old fashioned way. It's, lobbying.
They've got strong lobbying groups in the US.
Strong lobbying groups. I mean, a great book how they did it too was I'm reading the book Apple in China. It just was published this year about how China quietly captured, Apple. Basically, arguably one of the greatest companies in
Ah,
the world. There's so,
okay.
you send your factories there, they run surpluses, they invest in your treasuries. Like there's so much there was so much money sloshing around in that relationship. How can you go against that? Like there was,
Look
there
at
were
what
warnings about this.
look at Nvidia's pressure on the Trump administration to allow them to sell their chips to China. So it's just
There's
very it's just indirect influence through all these different lobbying groups and large corporations. I understand. Okay,
Yeah, the
I'm gonna read
Chinese
that
are
book,
very
Apple and
subtle.
China.
They're very subtle about everything. They are not the kind of like, we're going to punch you in the face and put a gun to your head. They are much more subtle than that.
What do you think their end game is? Is it really to coexist with the US, or could it be more sinister? I'm a bit naive, so I always look at the coexistence side, but I've been wrong time and time again. I thought Russia would never invade Ukraine. Here we are. I thought Iran would never be struck by Israel. Here we are. I never expected Qatar. So I tend to be pretty naive with those things, and I'm proving wrong, and I'm hoping not to be proven wrong when it comes to China. But could we? I, I think their intentions are good. I think they want to coexist with the US. But what happens when a new leader comes up after Xi Jinping? Something happens to Xi Jinping. We have a new leader who's a lot more hawkish and a lot more aggressive towards the US. Um, do you think there are rumblings in China on a plan that might include something more sinister than just coexistence? And could coexistence work? Does a multipolar world really work? Historically, has it worked?
I would first start by saying I don't think you're naive. I think you're an optimist, and I think that's a good thing. Um, I tend to agree that we can coexist. To me, I think the argument we have with China is less. It is often spun as by the powers that be in America that they want to do something much more sinister and control and what have you. And maybe I'm naive about that. However, I think it is less that and more the powers that be in America thinking they were untouchable as they offshored labor. They basically threw labor in the middle class and the factory base to China and figured they would never feel that competitive threat. I'm not talking about a takeover threat. It's the Chinese are making them actually compete. And I think that scares them. They've had, this
Mm,
sort of unipolar moment where, look, American companies didn't have to be very innovative for the last 20,
good
30 years.
point.
You don't have to compete. The Chinese are competing. And I think it scares them because their wealth is tied up in it. So I think we can coexist. A very wise long-term foreign policy expert once told me, like, there is no appetite in China politically for expansionism and foreign wars for a very simple reason that paradoxically US elites always flag as a weakness. But if you have a one-child policy and
That's
you
a
only have one
strength.
child, there is no appetite. Imagine being a Chinese parent and you have a George Bush come to power and say, we're going to go invade Iraq for what? And your one child that you've put everything into, your one legacy is
That's a
killed in
good
a
point.
war. There is no appetite for war, for foreign expansionism in China. And that's not my opinion. That was the opinion of someone who had 40, 50 years in Washington as a policymaker at the very highest levels. So I tend to agree with you that I think we can coexist. Multilateralism, it can work. People say it can't. And, there's always tensions. But look, how long did we have up until 1914? The four great empires, right? You had the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the British Empire, the Turkish Empire, Ottoman Empire, and there was one other, I guess, German, French. I don't know. I'm thinking of somebody else. At any rate, you had four great empires for hundreds of years up till 1914 when they sort of self-immolated. And oh, by the way, what was the lesson of that? All three of them ended in 4 years, and the last one, I guess, the Russian Empire is the last one. Excuse me. So it was
Oh yeah, of
Russian,
course.
Ottoman, Hungarian, um, and Austro-Hungarian and British. And by
Ottoman.
1918, the only one alive was left standing was the British, and it was mortally wounded. We took over the crown of hegemon, and so those four empires coexisted on some level. And of course, there were border skirmishes and disagreements and intrigue and stuff. It's not like everyone holds hands and sings kumbaya for those hundreds of years. But for several hundred years before, you didn't have this catastrophic threat of things that we've had sort of nonstop almost nonstop since 1914.
I don't think that there was the same dependence back then between, the Russian Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, British, Ottoman Empire. They didn't have that same interdependence they have today. All these different economies being merged together, um, and having that mutually assured destruction, economic destruction. If one declares war on the other, I think it's a good thing. That makes it potentially and hopefully more possible for a multipolar world. The last question I want to ask you, though, Luke, is one region that I love. I adore Europe. Adore Europe. And I've spent a lot of time there. And it's just sad to see what's happening in that region. At least what seems to be happening politically, socially, but also economically. It just seems that they're, at least from what I've seen on the outside, what people are saying, whenever I talk to anyone, everyone tends to agree that they've just essentially committed suicide. They've destroyed their own economies. Is that really true? Should we really write off the European economy? Because it's still a pretty large economy. I know it's not growing much. The energy crisis there, the dependence they have on other countries for their rare earth minerals, for their oil, for their energy as a whole, destroying nuclear in Germany, for example. It's sad to see, but is it being overblown, or the European economy is just screwed?
Take what I say with a grain of salt, because Europe has been sort of one of the things I got wrong for a long time. And the reason I got it so wrong is because they've acted so irrationally in exactly the way you described. Like,
I don't blame you. I don't blame you.
As someone of German descent on my father's side, right? My father's grandfather emigrated to America from from Germany, or outside of Germany, I guess, where Hungary is today. I have been astonished at how irrational Europe has been over the last 15 years. Absolutely astonished. Like, I don't understand. Like, the solution is very simple. You buy gas in euros from Russia. You then ramp up nuclear power, and you get cheap energy, and you combine the massive engineering and high-end consumer strength of all of that, the global relationships of having been colonial powers for multiple centuries, and expand those trade relationships, and also leveraging what is still a relatively affordable labor base, highly skilled labor base, by the way, in Eastern Europe as a result of the Berlin Wall having come in. They had it all right there, and they just kicked it all away. And I don't understand. I still don't understand why. I don't. To me, I don't understand why. And so that's why I got Europe so wrong. So to answer your question, they need somebody to come in and just. It's not hard. Like, just do what I just said. It's like the simplest thing in the world. It's the simplest thing in the world, but that doesn't make it easy. But I don't know why it's not politically easy. I think a lot of these far right,
exactly.
far right groups want to keep doing.
Like decommissioning all these nuclear power plants. I was looking at them like, what? And they're still doing it to this day. There was one decommissioned just a few weeks ago. Don't understand. You've just blown up the pipeline. The pipeline's just been blown up from Russia. You need those nuclear power plants, especially now with AI taking over the world. Energy's become the new, the new gold rush right now. And they're just shooting themselves in the foot to this day. It's mind-boggling. Trump is like, guys, I'm gonna walk away. We will not keep supporting you, even militarily. You're gonna slowly become on your own. They haven't changed. Hopefully, that will give them a kick up the ass. There's now talks about what is it? Germany wanting to become the biggest military in Europe. That's what they're working towards. That's what their goal is. France and Britain are starting to kick up, offering a nuclear umbrella to Germany. So militarily, they're starting to make a lot of changes, increasing their military spend. But when it comes to domestic capacity, I don't know. Will they shift to China instead of just focusing on becoming self-sufficient? We'll see. And we'll see what happens. Maybe then you'll become right with your predictions earlier. When the Ukraine war ends, they become more rational. Maybe the Ukraine war is making them very irrational. But time will tell.
Yeah, it's hard because there's just so much history there. I suspect that's some of the irrationality, right? My grandfather died fighting your grandfather 100 years ago over here, and therefore we can never be friends, kind of a thing. And on some level, I understand that, but on another level, like, here in America, like, there were a lot of awful things that we have, slavery and some of these things. And like, America's not perfect, but we keep working towards, sort of, most of us keep
the common
working
goal.
towards, a common goal, right? So
Hmm.
yeah, I'm hopeful they'll get it figured out, but it's hard because it's very discouraging to see some of the political processes there stifled, right? So when you
Hmm.
see what I think are some pretty rational positions taken by, to me, they don't seem to be very far right at all, but they're deemed far right. And hey, we don't want to do any more war. We want to, and those elections are nullified or recast, or like, that's not an encouraging trend. You're not going in the right direction once you start doing it. So there are rational people there, very clearly. My suspicion is they're the silent majority. Uh, but are they, do they have enough political power? Will things get far enough to really drive an impetus to get them moving in the right
Hmm.
direction? I hope so, but right now I'm not seeing
I
it.
hope so as well. I hope so as well. Luke, that was a great discussion. I appreciate we've covered pretty much everything I wanted to cover, and I'd love to do this again. It was, and I like your takes and the way you've analyzed things. So it's going to be a good discussion. I like how you mix the economic impact of different geopolitical decisions being done and the overlap that we're seeing, and kind of simplifying this for the audience that's not too deep in the financial world. So I really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you having me on and look forward to joining you again.